Okay, so we're going to begin with having each of our panelists talk a little bit about what makes you, you. Each of us, as some of my students know, we come from a tribe. And what is that tribe like? So these three questions for each one of you. How do you identify as a professional? Tell a little bit about your work and research. How do you identify culturally and ethnically? What tribe do you come from? How do you identify your worldview or your personal belief system? And why do you hold this view? So I think we're going to begin with Praveen.
All in 5 minutes. So before I begin, I want to thank Veritas for giving all three of us, all four of us here actually, the opportunity to speak to you all. The University of Washington for hosting this event, and really for each of you for taking time out of your schedules to be here today so we can have a robust conversation. I'm particularly looking forward to the time of Q&A afterwards. Can everybody hear me okay? No? Okay. I just need to bend down like this and then everything's okay. I'll try to project, but please sort of wave or something like that and let me know if you're not able to hear me. So what makes us human? Right? What makes you, you, as Jim said? That's the topic or the question for today's discussion. So let me start with a little bit of what I think makes me who I am. I'm a father, a husband, a Christian, a scientist with a Hindu background, Indian ancestry, Canadian birth, and American citizenship. So that's obviously a lot to unpack, especially in 5 minutes. So in my opening remarks this evening, I think what I'll do is highlight just three aspects of my identity. Okay, and so the first is my name, which is Praveen Sethupathy. It's of Sanskrit origin. My family also calls me Raghu, who is a great emperor in Hindu mythology, whose line gave rise to Rama. It's an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu. And Sethupathy, my last name, means Lord of the Bridge. This also refers to Rama because the bridge is a former chain of limestone shoals that connected the southern tip of India to the northern tip of Sri Lanka. And according to the ancient Hindu epic that some of you may have heard about, the Ramayana, the bridge was constructed by Lord Rama and his army. So needless to say, my name is steeped in ancient Indian tradition and Hindu lore, just about as much as it could be. And I like that. It's one of the precious few elements of my day-to-day life that serves as a welcome reminder to me of where I come from. It strengthens my bonds with my heritage and my family. And my father, who gave me my name, he grew up in a small village in South India where he was raised with age-old traditions and values that today I'm passing on to my children. India is an inextricable part of who I am, despite the fact that I have not spent a lot of my life there. I feel blessed to be an Indian American, and as an English-speaking Christian, born and raised in North America, I mean, my name is one of the few things that really serve as a reminder for me on a regular basis of where I come from. The second aspect of my identity that I want to share is my genetic makeup. And that brings it a little bit closer to home in terms of my vocation. Our DNA, it holds traces of not only our recent human ancestry, but also our longer evolutionary history. My genome contributes substantially to all sorts of prosaic traits like my skin color or my height, as well as more interesting traits like my competitive drive. And my genome even holds clues as to what kind of predispositions I might have to various diseases. But as much as genetics shapes my identity, it certainly doesn't seal the fate of my identity. For example, our environment heavily influences how our DNA works. Individuals with more or less identical DNA sequences will develop different traits and behaviors, in part as a result of how the unique conditions of their life and their lifestyle choices have shaped the way that their DNA functions. We can talk more about that if it's of interest as the evening progresses. But the key point is that our identities are certainly influenced, but not fully determined by our DNA. Individuals cannot be reduced to just the genomes in their cells. The third aspect of my identity I'd like to share is my spiritual nature. So, in the modern day, what is true or what is real is often understood as that which can be proven, right, by science or logic or reason. But it's really interesting to contrast that with ancient wisdom. In ancient Egypt, the word for truth is mat, which means that which binds all things together and maintains equilibrium in the universe. In Sanskrit, the word for truth is satyam, which means that which supports or sustains our very existence. In Hebrew, the word for truth is emet, which is composed of the first, middle, and last letter of the alphabet, suggesting that truth is that which encompasses and explains everything. We've gone from thinking about truth in that way to that which we can prove by reason. I mean, the period we live in of scientific advancement and technological advancement, it's introduced knowledge of the natural world at a pace that is unprecedented. And I'm excited by that, I'm thrilled by that, I'm motivated by that. But have we forgotten, right, that no matter how much reason achieves, it's still limited by the finite capacity of the human mind? Does that not even give us any pause anymore to consider whether there may be, not whether there definitely are, but whether there may be realities that science alone cannot illuminate? Blaise Pascal, he's a 17th century mathematician that some of you may be familiar with. He argued that there are many ways of knowing things that reason knows nothing about. As our science has greatly expanded, I feel as though our view of truth and reality has actually contracted. In my own spiritual journey during my undergraduate years, I studied many different faith traditions, including Christianity. And one of my first aha moments was that stripped of Christ, Christianity was actually no more or less compelling to me than any other faith tradition. It was really this person of Jesus that made all the difference to me. He's the supposed hero of the story, but is naked and broken on a cross. It seemed to me quite the opposite of a hero at first. But what I would learn is that he wasn't on the cross because he was powerless to stop it. He was on the cross because that's precisely how he would choose to exercise his power, laying his life down solely for the sake of others. The Bible calls this concept meekness. In our culture, it's often understood as being weak or timid. But in the original Greek, it actually means something closer to quiet strength, or the expression of power without any self-interest or self-promotion. You know, it's said, let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to those of others. And as a Christian, one who claims to follow in the ways of Christ and after the example of Christ, I'm called to live a life of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. Let's be clear, I don't always live up to that calling. I fall well short of that most of the time. But it really does shape the way that I think about who I am. You know, whether it be Syrian refugees, right, fleeing for their lives, or homeless on the streets of Seattle. I think the Christian call is not to be safe and sound, bunkered within the confines of our walls. I think it's to be willing to risk our lives for the life and dignity of others. It's to consider the interests and needs of others, even if it affects our comfort and safety. And I'm compelled to this ethic not merely out of logic or reason, but by my faith in who Christ is, what he's done for me, and the example that he sets for me. Justice and service for me are not optional for whenever it's convenient. Instead, they ought to be a way of life, natural outflows of my desire to follow Christ's example. And service toward others is, I don't think, what we do when we want to feel good about ourselves. I think, actually, it's what we do when we understand what it really means to be human. So that's a brief look for me at culture and genetics and faith and how all of those things inform my identity. Thank you again for the privilege of speaking to you all, and looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Keolu.
All right. Can everybody hear me in the back? In the nosebleeds? All right, cool. I appreciate everyone coming out. This is a wonderful opportunity. especially because the Golden State Warriors are playing right now. It's
Oh,
halftime.
man.
My bad, y'all. No. No, but I appreciate it. I'm Keolu, again. I'm from Hawaii originally. I'm from Niuli'i Ahupua'a. That is on the north Kohala coast of the Big Island of Hawaii, if anybody's familiar with that. Anyone been there? No? Got a few? All right, cool, cool, cool. So that's very much a part of my identity. And we have some very sacred geography in Hawaii, places like Mauna Kea, where you go to the top of the mountain. And I remember in 7th grade going up there and seeing the bulge in the Milky Way, because you're looking at the universe edge on, right? And this is one of the very few places in the universe where you can, on our planet, where you can actually observe relativity at its finest. And I remember one of my cousins being like, it's like a dinner plate, you just turn it over, you know? And this was this big aha moment for me. And, you know, and again, I've always begun to think about those things. So my name means the steadfast one, the keeper of the faith. Most people's names in Hawaii are related to the stars because we have a rich history of astronavigation. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But you always think about spirituality and how we've gotten here and those sorts of things. To sort of sum up my spirituality in, you know, this little summary here, I'll give you a little story about, I asked my father, I said, what's our religion, when I was really little? And I remember him looking at me and being like, we're universalists. We exist in the universe. And at the time I was like, huh? You know, I wanted to be like, what the hell are you talking about, man? You know, now that makes a lot of sense. We do exist here. I'm a scientist. I'm a student here, like many of you, at the University of Washington School of Medicine, Department of Genome Sciences. And all of my work, well, not all of it, but the majority of it focuses on using different types of genomic technology to survey human genetic variation. So on an empirical level, that's what I do all day. I look at what makes us human and what makes us different based on these differences in our genome. All the shades and scales and spectrums of human genetic variation. I'm infatuated with it. I love it. That's what I study. And, you know, one of the things that you alluded to earlier is that we do science a certain way at this institution. And I've begun to think about that in light of we're privileging a certain philosophy. We are privileging a certain type of knowledge. And it's not necessarily the truth. It's just what we know to be true. So I hope that we can talk a little bit more about that and deconstruct what that means, because it's very Western, the Kool-Aid that we're drinking here, you know? So, yeah, but that pretty much sums up. Did I hit everything on there?
That's good, man.
Worldview? Yeah, I think that's
That was
pretty
good.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Okay, Malia.
All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. I don't have prepared remarks. I will do my best. I'm not going to be as eloquent as Praveen, I'm afraid. Wonderful set of comments. Nor am I going to be able to reference looking up at the Milky Way on Mauna Kea, although Keolu and I think this is relevant actually to both the prior speakers' comments. Like Keolu, I was also born and grew up on the Big Island of Hawaii. And that's where I get my name, Malia. It's a Hawaiian name. It means calm, as in a calm ocean. It's something I aspire to. Those of you who know me or have ever encountered me know that I'm usually not very calm. Particularly when I'm sitting in front of a room full of people, I'm particularly not calm. But I did have this experience of growing up in perhaps the most beautiful place in the world. And in the way that happens when you grow up in one of the most beautiful places in the world, you completely take it for granted until you leave and you go away. So here I am. I am a local girl. Although when I was talking to Jim before we started, he says, you know, If I was going to pick where you were from, I wouldn't pick Hawaii. Maybe Maine. I'm like, yeah,
My bad.
I can see that.
Hey,
And
Maine is cool too.
And at various points in my life, people have guessed that perhaps I'm Canadian, that I'm from Canada. And I always think it's a high compliment. And it's partly because even though I grew up in Hawaii and I lived there until I was 18 years old, and then I went to Southern California to do my undergrad at Occidental College. Yay, go Oxy. And I was kind of not exactly a Valley gal, but I said like a lot. And then I was incredibly fortunate to be granted the chance of a lifetime to be able to go to England to study. And I actually went to England, to Oxford, to study, to do my graduate work. And here's where the connections continue between Keolu and I, because what I did my graduate work in was in human genetics and in human population genetics. And what I was interested in then, and what I continue to be interested in, is understanding what makes us human from the point of view of understanding the ways in which written in our bodies is the history of our species. And I really didn't know that much about that when I was an undergraduate. I was pre-med. I was looking to kind of save lives. My father got to Hawaii because he worked for the university, but he was a physicist, and I really didn't like all that hard science stuff. But I knew I loved biology. I knew from an early age I was fascinated by genetics. I was fascinated by the way in which we can tell that people and their families are related to one another, and how people who in the same family, the same upbringing, can be so much alike and so very different at the same time. And I came to learn that we can think about that same kind of problem of our similarities and differences on a species-wide level. And so I sort of learned to do that work in England, and then I ended up staying in England for a long time, which is why people think I'm Canadian, because I don't quite sound American. I certainly don't sound Hawaiian. Although I start sounding more Hawaiian when I go home. And then I slowly, and I did science for a long time. I was a geneticist for a very long time. I did several scientific postdocs. I taught in the UK, and then I came back to the US, and I did more scientific work. I was doing work trying to associate genes with complex traits and complex trait genetics. And then I sort of had this early midlife crisis where I said, wow, this is really great work inferring the effects of natural selection on patterns of genetic variation in genes, but I feel like there should be more. And I had the most amazing and wonderful mentor who I will owe for the rest of my life. I was kind of casting about. I knew I wanted to kind of change direction, and I wasn't sure what to do. I was thinking quite seriously about going into the pharmaceutical industry and working for big pharma and making lots of money. And this mentor of mine, asked me this question, and it was a kind of a throwaway in an email, but he said to me, he says, Malia, he says, when nobody is looking over your shoulder and asking you or telling you what you should be doing, what is it that you want to do? What do you like doing? What do you love doing? And I was just completely taken aback. I was just, what do you mean? What would I want to do? I'm supposed to be doing this. I mean, I'd already kind of done one. I hadn't gone to medical school as I was supposed to. Stayed in England way too long. But I mean, I was being a scientist is what I was a little fourth grader carrying around my microscope. I was always going to be a scientist. And he says, but I cast back to my liberal arts undergraduate work, and I realized that I had been a religious studies minor. I had been very, very serious about religion as an undergraduate. And I realized that what had really captured me in my teaching and interacting with students around genetics was not so much the science, not so much the population genetics, but the meaning of it, the consequences of what we were learning about ourselves. And I went, wow, I think I'd like to try to do this instead. And my mentor, bless him, said, go and do that. I will support you. And he helped me to get a fellowship from the National Institutes of Health which allowed me to retrain, to cross-train. And so quite late in my career, I became a bioethicist. someone who thinks about the ethical, legal, and social implications of human genetics, genetic testing, and human genetic research. And that's what I've been doing here at the University of Washington for the last few years. It allows me to stay very close to the science that I love, that I'm still deeply interested in and have a lot of prior training in. But now I can actually use that scientific background to think more deeply about the social and ethical consequences of this knowledge. The ways in which we are using this technology, both to illuminate who we are as a species, but also possibly to change us. We have a radically new power in our lives that we haven't had until very recently because of technology. What are we going to make of this power? Now, very briefly, because I know I'm almost out of time, I mean, I haven't really said very much about my worldview. My worldview is very complicated. As I said, I took religion very seriously when I was an undergraduate. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I spent every Sunday in church looking up at Jesus on the cross. I no longer identify according to that worldview. What I gave the Veritas group for this was humanist. I think that comes closest. I actually belong to a religious organization. I go to a group called Unitarian Universalists. Which are very interested in thinking about the inherent worth and dignity of all human persons, thinking about the interconnectedness of all of us, human and non-human, around the globe. And that is, I look for truth and I get my wisdom about how to think about these deep ethical and social questions from many different sources, including Jesus, including Buddha. And bringing those all back together to think very deeply about how to take that collective wisdom that has come to us through the human species and to apply that to make choices in our lives. So I think I've touched on everything.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
That's very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very rich. Thank you, guys. I'm going to open this up, and anyone can speak now. And you've noted this. I think one of the questions that is being asked is the scientific method, the empirical method, the only source of truth? And it really is clear from all three of you that it really isn't, even for you all who are scientists. You talked about there's something more, there's meaning, ethics. Truth can be talked about as that which binds, that which supports, that which encompasses. There's realities beyond the senses. Even our names, keeper of the faith. The person we are, you called calm and peace. So I'm just kind of wondering, is there a way, I think students struggle with this, is the only truth what we can empirically prove, or is everything else relative? And that's really a bad option, isn't it? Yeah, go.
Yeah, I'll start off briefly just by thinking about the scientific method. And I think everyone here has had a chance to deal with the scientific method, whether it's like in your elementary school cafeteria with your little science project, right? We all remember those days. But yeah, I did a little research before I came here. And apparently the term comes from 1215 by a guy named Roger Bacon. He was probably wearing something very similar to this gentleman over here. He's a friar. And he's credited with the term, the scientific method. He was from like Yorkshire, England, or something like that. Now that doesn't mean that the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians, for example, knew that the sun was at the center of the universe. They even have documented archaeological research that shows planets outside of the sun and what that means and so on and so forth. And my ancestors in Hawaii, for example, would use, bird migration patterns and ecological metadata, for example, to determine which way to point their canoe. And this was well before 1200. You're using observations in nature. Many different cultures and communities of people have been conducting what we now call the scientific method. So then that begs the question I want to ask you guys. Is it still the scientific method if we didn't call it that 5,000 years ago? Or is it something completely independent of that? So.
Good question.
Yeah.
Okay, go guys.
I think that it is more or less the scientific method. It depends on exactly how we are defining it, I suppose, right? But just the notion that we have hypotheses and that we can go and test those hypotheses, right? And maybe even taking it another step further, that we can, in evaluating those hypotheses, actually demonstrate repeatability or reproducibility, right?
Yeah.
So if taken just at that skeleton, right, then all of the things you're describing could fall under the kind of umbrella of the scientific method, which I think, to me, it's irrelevant whether, you know, we called it that at the time or not. I absolutely agree with you that it has been happening for a very, very long time before we gave it a name, right? I think for me, the more critical point is whether that's really the only way of knowing. And I think we've already sort of all alluded to the fact that, no, I don't think it's really the only way of knowing. But I think it's being posed as a question in part because there is that fallacy out there, right? That knowledge gained via the scientific method is the only way of really knowing something, right? When in fact, I think that runs counter to our everyday experience, right? I think we're constantly engaging other ways of knowing without maybe even really realizing it, right? But I think there's, other than scientific knowledge, there's historical knowledge. There are ways in which to peruse historical texts and documents and things like that that are not analyzed in a scientific way per se, according to the definition I just provided. But there are certainly tools and techniques historians use in order to gain knowledge, right, from different kinds of materials. Right? There's instinctual, kind of intuitive knowledge, right? And interestingly, one of the best examples for this actually comes from mathematics. So he threw out a famous person. I'll throw out another famous person. I think I may have mentioned him already, but Blaise Pascal. Right? He's a fascinating theologian, mathematician, physicist. One of the things he says is that when you prove a theorem in mathematics, right, the way that it works is that to prove a statement, you've got to prove a statement before that. But to prove that statement, you've got to prove another statement before that. And you do that ad infinitum, actually. It's a problem called infinite regress. So the way that mathematicians deal with this is to say, well, at some point we've got to stop it, and we've got to say, these are axioms, these are postulates, these are things we just take to be true. We assume them, and we move forward from them.
That sounds like religion.
It does, doesn't it?
And
Yeah.
that's what Blaise Pascal said. He said, no one has a problem with this, though, because these are things that we all instinctively know and understand. And we take them to be true, but they're not proven by logic or reason or the scientific method per se. They're just intuitively known and understood. So these are just examples of ways in which, even in science, something as hard as mathematics, right, we are starting from the assumption that there are other ways of knowing things. And that they are often integrated with the scientific method in ways that sometimes make people feel uncomfortable, but actually reflect reality best.
Yeah. No, and I would not disagree. I think there's a lot of the ways in which we do science currently, there are premises that are built into the ways that we ask questions about the world, which hold within them assumptions. And so what we choose to understand or know about the world basically relates to the kinds of things that we believe are important to know. And different people, coming from different faith traditions, different cultural backgrounds, are going to want to know different things, ask different questions, and the way you pose the question is going to give you a different kind of answer. What I do think is interesting is this piece about empiricism and sort of going out and perceiving the world. Our senses mislead us, for example. I mean, we might think that the sun revolves around the earth, for example, because of the way in which the sun sets and falls. And yet, it took astronomers and mathematicians very careful work to basically demonstrate that that was an illusion, that our senses were misleading us. But for a long time, those inferences about the way in which the universe was constructed were incredibly controversial, right? Because they seem to go against what people could see or perceive. And so I think it's very, very complicated. I personally believe there are lots of different truths, lots of different ways to know about the world. And I also think that even the things that we hold as facts in the scientific context are themselves deeply contingent and constructed, and a function of the ways in which we pursue science and the history of science. And that's sometimes hard for people who are dyed-in-the-world empiricists to really get a hold of. You know, what? My facts are not facts? Well, no, they are facts, but they're facts that we've come to learn in a particular way as a consequence of the questions we've asked. Yeah.
Let me just move us, because we don't have that much time. This is so rich. You all are in the field of genetics, and there's so much happening. Even at the dinner table, I've learned new things. I learned that American scientists did eugenics in the early part of the 20th century. And I think that's a fear and a question among many people. Are genetic scientists trying to change the human being literally? And are there problems with that, or are there fruitful things as well? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so how many people in this audience are familiar with something called CRISPR or genome editing? Did anybody?
Quite a
Okay,
few.
cool. All right, awesome. So it's pretty mainstream at this point. If you're not familiar, I'll just give you a kind of brief summary. It's like you up there with the laptop out. We see you. It's like you, you know, it's a global search and replace tool for a potential, you know, mutation in the human genome. So you can change and augment the things that you want, that are desirable, potentially, right? So you guys can imagine designing something that's as close to what we think is perfect as possible. So, I mean, if that's not eugenic, then I don't know what is. But the thing that you should be really concerned about, and I'm not trying to scare everyone. I had a conversation with my buddy Billy over here, a while ago about this. I don't want everybody, I'm not trying to pull a Donald Trump and be like, you should be scared about this. But you should know that it exists, and that right now, currently, there are policies in place, a moratorium is in place to not edit human embryo cells. And that's because this is extremely omnipotent technology. And if used in the wrong ways, it could completely socially stratify our community. You could have the worst versions of the haves and the have-nots. And that is terrifying, right? Because if you don't have access to health care, then you potentially don't have access to engineering your children. And now we're talking about a brave new world. Mm-hmm. So, you know.
You didn't want to scare them.
No, not at all. But there's a really good, if you guys like Radio Lab, I don't mean to plug it, but there's a really good summary of everything and to think about, because we only have so much time here. But go ahead if you guys want to piggyback on that one.
Mm-hmm. Yes. No, I will agree with that. I actually want to go back, Jim, to your point about eugenics. It's not only, so were you learning about the eugenics was something that was pursued in the United States, but I think it's rather important to understand that eugenics was really invented, or certainly, I mean, made popular in the United States.
Right.
And eugenics in its earlier stages was about sort of being well-born, was about sort of pursuing the betterment of the species. It was completely socially accepted. It was cutting edge. It was considered unproblematic at the time that these ideas were promulgated at the start, at the start of the 20th century. In much the same way that genetic engineering today is sort of taken for granted and is a good thing. It's only in retrospect, and really because of what happened during the Second World War and the way in which Nazi Germany took the kind of the logic of eugenics to its fullest and horriblest extent, that we now look back retrospectively on this project and say, oh my God, how could anyone have thought that that was an appropriate thing to do? Right? But here we are now, and it's very interesting to think about when we move forward 50 years from now and we look back on this period of time, this incredibly exciting period of time with these technologies which are allowing us really in unprecedented ways to manipulate the genomes not only of ourselves but of all manner of organisms, of plants, of animals. of where we are, and I talk to my students about this, where we can no longer merely think about creation as something which is in the hands of a deity up there, but we are ourselves creators. What do we think about that? How do we think about that power? What responsibilities do we have to use that well? How do we think about that? Keolu is sort of right. There is a moratorium on editing embryos, but in fact, 4 different countries now have said that it's okay to do this germline gene editing in embryos for research purposes.
England, right?
England,
England's one of them, yeah.
Sweden, I think. I'm not remembering the other 2, but I just saw it recently. Why do we allow this? Because we want to understand if we can do it safely or not. Okay. If we think that that's the primary ethical concern or the safety concerns, but we aren't asking some of these prior questions about should we be doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah, another really interesting and prominent example, in addition to the whole gene editing that we now have the ability to do with CRISPR-Cas9 technology, is synthetic biology, right? The opportunity, as I believe Malia was alluding to create new organisms, right? Although, I do have to here, as an aside, say this really nice joke, cartoon that I always find really compelling is where, a human being and God said, okay, let's compete and see who's the better creator, right? And then the human being went to go get some dirt and God said, get your own dirt. So
I love it.
that is a little bit of where we are with synthetic biology. I do agree it's a tremendous power that we have, and with that great power comes a great responsibility, right?
Yeah.
But to be clear, we are making, it's not out of nothing, right? We are making out of what we have, right?
Yes.
But even that is an incredible power, right? Now we can get scared of it and throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, that whole thing, I don't even want to hear anything about it. That sounds like you're playing God, right?
Correct.
Or we could say, throw caution to the wind. Let's do this. Sounds fun.
Jurassic Park.
Right? Right? That's right. But I think the healthiest space is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And to achieve that middle ground, okay, it's like most things in life, right? But we need the people that are involved in this work to come together. So let me just first say, why do I think synthetic biology can actually be some good? Well, what if you can engineer bacteria, right, that you can put in the soil that'll metabolize chemicals, toxins that would otherwise be leaching into the drinking water for people, right? And thereby neutralize those compounds and not be toxic for people. That sounds like a wonderful, I think we'd all say, well, that sounds good, sign me up, right? But it's the same technology that has the ability to do a lot scarier things, right? So where do we draw the line as a community, right? And I think a lot of this comes from how do we define being responsible, right? So I think it's probably not the hardest to get scientists together for the most part and say, we should be responsible about this, right? But I think where the rubber's gonna meet the road is, what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
When we've got a group of people coming together and they're drawing their ethics from very different sources, right? Some could be mixed sources, some could be Christian source, some could be nothing at all, and defined by something else altogether, right? How do those people come together and draw up appropriate guidelines that all can agree is responsible? I think that's where the challenge really is. That's the next frontier.
Can I just, this is great. We're going to have student questions, so you can begin to think about that. And there's going to be microphones, I think, down here and down over there. So that'll happen in about 5 or 10 minutes. I think as a final question, this is really going fast. At least in the monotheistic traditions, Western traditions, we would say God created human in God's own image, right? I mean, that's the claim. And you could certainly draw from that we should not mess with that image. And so anyway, I'm just kind of curious, what are the why don't you, each of you, think about the sources of your worldview. How would you, what is the sources of responsibility? I mean, I think that's a great question. And maybe each of you can, because I think, how do you determine what is the appropriate source and our source of responsibility? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just going to take the easy out on this one. And I think that, ultimately, it's like a brain trust of individuals that should be making wonderful decisions on our behalf, right? And these are people that we elect, and they're supposed to exist in the Beltway, right? In the Beltway, Washington, D.C. area. And when you think about things like science, for example, I happen to know, and I don't want to get too political, but Ted Cruz was the head of the NASA Space and Competitiveness Committee. Now, I don't really think he knows that much about rocket science, right? I'm just throwing that one out there. He probably doesn't know anything about astrophysics or, all of these, interesting kind of nuggets of information that you might need to design policy that is potentially, would benefit us all in a responsible way, right? So, but when you ask a scientist who is qualified, they're like, hell no, I'm not doing that job. I want to sit here in this, ivory tower, so to speak, and conduct my research in quiet and submit my, research to this journal and apply for this public grant and all of these other things. And it's just this very myopic view of how we do things. And so I think that is a tragedy that we all need to work on. And for all of the students in the crowd, think about that. Think about, these are the people that make decisions on our behalf. And what is your obligation to public service? Whether it's through your community, if you're Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, whatever that is, are you doing enough? Really think about that when you go home. I'm going to think about it too. I think about it all the time. But
it's great, thank you. Yeah, you want to, whatever.
So sources of response, it's interesting to hear Keolu's perspective on this. I think that it's, we need the help of our elected officials, we need the help of the scientific community, we really need the help of folks just like you, everyone in the room. We need general members of the public, those of you who at some point very soon are going to walk into a doctor's office and the doctor is going to determine that you need a prescription medication of some sort. And he or she is going to offer you a genetic test prior to prescribing that medication, because they will be able to make a choice about what kind of drug to prescribe for you on the basis of that genetic information. And so we can talk about this sort of scary editing embryos, but right now the reality is genetics is going to become a part of all of our lives. And yet I would venture to say, I would guess that the majority of you have not thought deeply about this. Not because you aren't thoughtful people, but because nobody has invited you to think about these questions. Nobody has invited you to take your religious convictions and your moral principles and direct them to thinking about the kind of world you want to live in and the place of genetic information in that world. And we need to be having those conversations in public fora like this and in other settings, because everyone's opinions count. And for many of us in the room, these decisions are not going to be, this isn't going to be a kind of a theoretical armchair conversation. You are going to be offered tests and procedures either for yourself or for your unborn children, and you're going to be having to make choices about whether you're going to want to know that information and how you're going to act on that information. And right now, it's just going to be given to you without any say in the matter unless we begin to start having broader conversations. And so I think that some of the discussion and decision-making about how we use this information responsibly, what kinds of science should be pursued, are conversations that we need to be having with people beyond the scientific community, and like today.
You want to?
Just one.
You're dying to say something. Yeah,
just
go ahead.
one quick, dying here. Okay. So, what if I told you that 95% of clinical trials have included individuals of European ancestry. When I look around in this room alone, it's a reflection of the diversity at multiple institutions. But the fact that 95% of these drugs have not included many of the different ethnicities that are a part of the United States of America is a tragedy. And I would wager that this is the first time many of you are hearing this. And what are we doing about it? Exactly. Think about that. That's...
I think the comments that both Malia and Keolu shared, and maybe this is a very fitting way to end this segment, because I think they really bring it back to what makes us human. Because I think that is a fundamental question we all do have to wrestle with and answer as we answer other questions like from where do we draw our ethics? How do we find common ground with those who are drawing ethics from different places in our secular communities? And what does responsibility look like, right? And for me, from a Christian standpoint, as I alluded to in my opening remarks, part of my identity is wrapped up in the image of God concept. And I don't believe that that has to do with our material origins or how we look and appear, as much as it is the function, the role that we play in this created order. I believe that we have been set apart, not so much biologically, as we have been from the standpoint of what our role is here on earth. And one of the terms that's used in Scripture is actually minister of reconciliation. Sort of a fancy term for a person who brings together instead of tears apart. A person who heals and doesn't inflict wounds, right? This is the entire story of what Jesus has done for us from a Christian worldview, right? And then becomes the calling on our lives toward others, right? So that's, for me, fundamental to how I think about my responsibility, is to be a minister of reconciliation, right? And I encourage all of you to think about that. What is it that makes you human? And how does that inform what you think you're responsible for to yourself and to others?
Great, that's great. Are there questions ready? We'd love to get students' questions or professors' questions or whatever. Is anybody?
Praveen, my name is Billy Edelman, and my question to you is if you've ever thought about how much your religious practice plays into wellness and health for you, if you could answer that question, and then bring it back to biology. So I think for me, the way I connect my spiritual world and my scientific self, I'm also a scientist, I'm Keolu's classmate, full disclosure. I make the connection between spirituality and biology when I have a spiritual experience or a religious experience, and I realize that there's this crosstalk between me as a human being having a spiritual experience versus a spiritual being having a human experience, and I always find myself in the middle there. And I think that's really my question, is have you ever thought about that?
So is the first question, thank you for the questions, by the way. The first question is, does my spirituality or religious practice inform wellness and health? Yeah, I think definitely so, in the sense, again, that I believe it is a part of who I am, and a part of all of us, actually, our spiritual natures. And so, very integral to our spiritual natures is the fact that, I think Jim was saying this earlier, that we want to know and be known, right? And we're highly relational beings. And I think a lot of, even when I was talking about being ministers of reconciliation, that is going out there and engaging and bringing people together instead of tearing apart, right? And so being relational beings, I think that that being in healthy relationship actually does bring us health and wellness. And a lot of what I am driven to through my Christian faith is to build relationships, to build healthy relationships with people. Different kinds of relationships, but relationships that nonetheless are built on a kind of sincere love and mutual respect, in saying, you are a person with dignity just as much as me, made in the image of God just as much as me. And So in that way, it does build that relationship, which I think does lead to full wellness and health for a human being.
Great. Yep.
I think there was a second question that
It was just, I wanted to maybe speak to the idea of really specifically as a scientist, where maybe specifically you're realizing that you're having this feedback in your own neurons, right? And it's not just the religious experience, but it's also like, whoa, I just activated oxytocin.
Do you have those kinds of conscious thoughts? I just activated oxytocin. I know exactly. I understand what you mean. I do think about that a lot, actually, because that's actually really quite beautiful for me. Because we're in those moments we're embracing both of the aspects of our nature, our biological nature and our spiritual nature, and not only appreciating that they both exist, but saying they're not quite as separate and distinct as we always like to make them, right, in our culture. That there's an intersection there that may be hard to verbalize, but is true nonetheless in our experience.
Excellent. Can we go to this side?
Oh, you can hold it. Yeah, I have a quick question, mainly directed to those of you with a Christian worldview, but anyone can answer. And that is, it's more of an intersection between science and theology. And what I'm wondering is, as I understand modern science, if you look at the Genesis account, for example, that you look at if there is a God, that God creates with smaller bits of information, genetic code, and builds on that, and then you arrive at natural selection through man, so to speak. And yet, on the other hand, theologically, if you believe that Adam was a literal man, and through Adam, sin entered the world, do you believe in a literal Adam? And if so, how do you square that with your understanding of Genesis and the evolution? And if you don't believe in the literal Adam, how do you square that with Paul and Romans?
Yeah. I think that's for me. Those are really great questions, but I want to say right off the bat that there are a lot of people with questions. So what I'm going to do is try to give you as pithy of an answer as possible, but still gets to the heart of it. And I would love to follow up with you either today or by email afterwards, because it is a longer discussion. And I've thought about those questions a lot. So I have a lot to say about it, and I could go on forever. So what I'll do is just tell you that my viewpoint is something called evolutionary creationism. What that means is that God is the creator and the sustainer of the world, and that his mode of creation involved biological evolution. As I was alluding to earlier, I don't actually think there's that much in our biology that distinguishes us from other species. A lot of attempts, even by scientists, to delineate different species through biological traits have ended up failing, right? So I think what delineates us is spiritual in nature, is the image of God. It's ontological. It's the functional role that we play in the created order, okay? Now, how is that consistent with Genesis account and Adam and Eve, right? I think what's important to appreciate is that if you go all the way back, there's this sense that the controversy around evolution and biblical faith is a somewhat of a new controversy, right? And that this effort to read Genesis in different ways is a concordist effort to try to fit into something science has taught us, right? And it's not at all the case. So different views and interpretations go all the way back to ancient rabbinical teachers, early church fathers, right? There are a plethora of diverse views on how people are reading and understanding Genesis 1 and 2. Now, there's a shared theme across all of those views. God is the creator. No other thing is created except for by God, right? And a number of other things that are shared throughout all of those different views. But whether or not this is meant to be a material account, whether or not it's not material, there are diverse views on that, well before there's any conversation about evolution or anything like that. People who hold an evolutionary creation position, there are some who believe in a literal Adam and Eve. Even those that do believe there's a literal Adam and Eve will say that there were many other humans around at that time. That's just consistent with the data that we have available, and frankly with some interpretations of Genesis as well. But there were many other people around. Adam and Eve were selected as representatives of humanity in the manner in which Abraham was selected and Moses was selected, and that whatever rebellion Adam and Eve exhibited was spread throughout humanity as sin, much in the manner that Christ's death on the cross is a propitiation that spreads throughout humanity and covers as an atonement, right? So there are themes that can be picked on to understand what Genesis is maybe really talking about here, and maybe not so much this is the material account of creation, right?
Yeah, I think this is very good. Can I say something?
Please.
I just think the overwhelming nature of the empirical method forced many Christians to make this judgment on the biblical text. And when you read St. Augustine, most people think he was Orthodox, and really the father of the Western Church, did not believe in a literal Adam and Eve. So this, that has been a great drag on making Christianity, Islam, and Judaism make any sense to many contemporary people who are thinkers on these issues. So I think it's unfortunate.
But I encourage you to ask the questions.
I do,
Because
yeah, I
you
do
should, you should take Genesis, when people contend
Seriously.
that I don't take, you should take it seriously, and people contend I don't take it literally. I actually say I think I am taking it literally, because my view of taking something literally is, what is the author's intention? What is intended in this communication? Right?
Also, and I'll say this too, and I told you this, read the book of Genesis. If you haven't read the book of Genesis, it's one of the great books of literature in all human history. And so anyway, so this, I am not saying that it should not be taken seriously. Yeah.
Right. But there is a lot of good scholarly work
Yes.
done on understanding what is really being communicated in Genesis 1 and 2. Just to quickly throw it out there, if this response wasn't full enough for you, John Walton is someone that you can read. He wrote The Lost World of Genesis 1 and The Lost World of Adam and Eve. N.T. Wright is someone that you can read. He wrote something called Surprised by Scripture, one of his latest works. A number of others I could suggest as well. BioLogos is an organization that you could look to for more on this.
Do you want to?
Oh, I was just going to add, I think less Adam and Eve and more Lucy than Adam. You know her? Look her up. Australopithecus afarensis. Yeah, that's it, just to keep it
Yeah,
short.
no, that's good. Let's keep it, yeah, okay.
Yeah, in the category of things that should make us scared, big things like CRISPR, there's also, of course, the issue of climate change, species extinction, a planetary ecological collapse. And one of the things that makes humans unique, of course, is that we are both creators and destroyers, and are the only species on this planet right now that is not subject to natural selection, essentially. So maybe only the second time in the planet's history, the last time being when there were bacteria that emitted huge quantities of oxygen that drove other species extinct, we have the possibility of tearing this all down. So I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of human stewardship of the Earth as a unique attribute.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, I have faith in science and innovation, so I feel like any damage we've done to our beautiful Mother Earth here, we could potentially, hopefully with the right scientific advancements, reduce CO2, et cetera. I really hope so. And then, I know this isn't probably a news flash, but it's not going to be the first or last mass extinction. So, just throwing that one out there.
Okay. Yeah, I thought you were going for hope there. Whoa. Okay. No, that's good. That's good. A little bit of reality is
Yeah.
always good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what Freud would say.
Yep,
You
keep
need
it real.
reality.
Keep it
Okay,
real.
over there.
As a person who considers spirituality as part of my innate identity, but also as a person that is currently dabbling in synthetic biology, I think that the discussion on responsibility is an interesting one, because it's one of the few things that's intertwined between science and faith. And so on responsibility, my question is, the things that determine people's decisions in responsibility are morals and ethics. What do you think is the difference, or the lack of difference, between morals and ethics?
Malia, I think
Well,
you're the
you know,
ethicist.
I'm not even sure. Here I am. I'm in a bioethics department. I should be able to sort of rattle off a response to that, right? But I'm not totally sure I know how to answer that. I mean, ethics is sort of a branch of philosophical reasoning about how to make better or worse choices, for lack of a better word. Morals often comes to us from a religious background or sort of a theological tradition, which tells us that there are ways in which that it's broader than a merely sort of consequentialist frame, which is a lot of what drives sort of current bioethical thinking, which is like, is it the right thing to do because it's going to result in the greatest amount of good versus bad? Whereas with morals, you can begin to start asking questions about, you can bring more of a sort of deontological frame where you can, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not usurp the dominion of a creator God, for example. And then I think it becomes a little more complicated in terms of synthetic biology, because is the tinkering that you're doing in the lab, sort of in terms of making changes to closed networks, gene networks, is that the same as God fashioning Adam out of the clay? And it probably isn't. And yet, things that we're doing now on a very small scale in the laboratory could give us the capacity to make truly radical changes to our bodies and to our environment, back to the question about stewardship, in a way that begins to look a little bit more like that earliest biblical creation event. And then I think you have to think very carefully, and then this comes back to this problem of how one puts one's scientific practice into that broader spiritual framework. I don't know.
Malia, can I ask a
Yes.
question there? So how do we, when you talk about, will an action or a behavior lead to a greater good
Yes.
or a greater bad, how do you define good and bad?
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? Good for whom, right?
Yeah.
Good in what way?
Right.
Maybe doing the work in the lab is really good for the advancement of knowledge. It's good for your research institution.
Correct.
It's good for your academic career, right? Maybe it's not ultimately good for the integrity of the planet. How do we know? It's very hard for us humans, as bright as we are, to forecast. I think if any of us could go back in time, just even 2 generations, to our grandparents' time, and say, and some of you, my grandparents are deceased, but some of you have grandparents you can talk to. In your wildest dreams, could you have ever imagined we would be where we are now with technology?
Yeah.
So it's very hard to forecast. So we have to do the best we can, and we have to make the choices but this is why I think it's so important that we need to involve many more people than just the folks in our lab in this conversation. Because what is good for us in our scientific practice may not be good for indigenous Hawaiians living in North Kohala, for example. And we have to start thinking about consequences as they ripple out beyond our immediate selves. And that's hard work to do unless you're doing that in relationship and in conversation.
I think related to that, let me just throw out there that, with all of these kinds of difficult questions, take a moment for yourself and just think, do I think if this happened, it'd be good or bad? Maybe walk through a series of a couple of those examples. And then I want all of us, myself, to ask the question, why do I think that's good? Why do I think that's bad?
Right.
Where does that come from? Right? That again feeds into this notion of what makes us human, right? But that's another way of getting there. But we are often always talking about this is good and that's bad. And oftentimes we don't really get to the heart of the matter of why we feel that way, because there's maybe concordance on a lot of things that are good and bad. But there are some things that are a little bit more divisive, right? So where does your goodness or badness feelings about things come from, right? I think it's worth thinking about that. Maybe you come up with different explanations, but I think it is remarkable that we often don't even consider that. Right? We use those words all the time and have even strong feelings one way or the other all the time, but aren't actually pinpointing where that's coming from or why we feel that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, that's a good segue into my question. So we live in a globalized world with many different perspectives. We're a pluralistic society. So for young people like us with no particular reason to choose one viewpoint over another, I think a lot of people are left just, okay, I'm just going to follow my heart, as Disney might say. But I guess in the absence of a higher law or an absolute standard, for instance, what's to prevent us, for instance, of looking into my heart and doing, as a stereotypical example, Adolf Hitler, you could say he looked into his heart and he decided the mass genocide of a whole race was good for his nation, That's what he believed in. So is there a higher law, or is there a privileged or even objectively true framework that we can trust to guide our lives rightly? So that's my question.
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you'll know at this point that I believe that there is. I don't believe that that's provable, right? I'm not going to prove to you that God exists or that if he does, it's this particular God, right? If I had a lot more time, I could walk you through sort of why it was compelling for me. It does actually come back to relationship, right? And the person that I was getting to know more than anything else and what I believe he did for me. But I do believe there is objective reality, right, on what's good and bad. We may not always have a window into it. I think that we're still going to struggle and wrestle with that a little bit. But that's why, in part, I'm encouraging you guys to think about where you think some of those feelings of this is good and bad comes from. Right? But I do believe that, and I believe that also, a greater recognition of that can guide us, right, in making decisions together as communities when we have these kinds of difficult things that we're wrestling with, right? Because I do share your concern that if it's a sort of everybody does what they feel is right, that seems like that there's chaos there. But I also appreciate the other side of, well, how do you know this objective reality is really the objective reality? That's a fair question too. So that's why we all need to do our work with a little bit of sort of reverence and fear and trembling to say, hey, it's real important that we get this right. It's actually not just like, oh, let's be religious or not, or whatever feels good. It's actually, we're talking about humanity here and our role in it and what our future is.
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on what you were saying, and it's kind of philosophy 101 class, right? You have these two principles. You have what is the greater good, what is utilitarian, what is going to benefit the most people, what is balanced, what is fair, and then you have your contract with yourself, and you say, okay, if I jump in that lake where that baby is drowning, is it going to affect me? No, the right thing is to go and save the baby, but you could ask yourself that question. That's how you get these people like Hitler, for example, right? They get stuck in this loop of their own contract with themselves, what they think is right, what these ideologies actually are, when in reality, you should be putting your family first, your community. What does that represent? Well, if you're in Kyoto at a Zen Buddha, or if you're in, if you're a Muslim or what, it doesn't really matter what it is, right? I mean, to me, whether it's Christian or anyone, are you putting your community first? Is everyone balanced? Is everybody happy? Does that determine the allocation of resources? But in some cases, even that can become too extreme with things like socialism. These types of experiments have been considered by many people failures. So, just something to think about.
Just very briefly, I think where it gets hard, though, of course, is when you have well-meaning people who hold deeply to their personal beliefs and who believe that they have the one way of knowing the world,
Correct.
the one source of knowledge, the one source of truth. And they've put themselves in opposition to others who hold different ways of knowing. And then we end up with a lot of the conflict that we see around the world currently, from people who hold to different creeds, who hold to different backgrounds, who who understand the right thing to do differently, and who judge. And then I think it becomes very, very complicated, right? And so I think it's an important question. It's an important question, a hard question. Evolutionary biologists, I feel compelled to say, people like Richard Dawkins would sort of make the argument that it's simply our genes telling us to be altruistic, right? To allowing, that we're going to be nice to others in order to give us enough time to procreate and get those genes into the next generation.
How do you respond to that?
It's an idea. It's an idea that actually has a lot of empirical merit. There's a lot of really good data from lots of species that something like that is going on, and yet it seems like not enough. Right?
It feels like pretty thin gruel
Yeah.
to locate your life that way.
That's right. Absolutely.
Okay, final concluding
Oh,
remarks.
are we there? Really?
We
Oh my
are
gosh.
at a, this has been great, hasn't it? Don't clap yet, we need time. So you get 1 minute each. Please leave students with one final thought. What would you challenge students to do going forward in light of the conversations tonight? Anyone?
I guess I'll go first really quickly, guys. I would say this. Again, challenge everything. The institution that you're asked, ask questions. And, surround yourself with people you want to be like. If you're at a house party and you're the most interesting person in the room, leave.
That's the best advice I've heard
Yeah.
in a long time.
I love it.
At a house party. I'm going to write this down.
Yeah. Are you done?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to be able to give. I think that one thing I will say, first, I'm so happy to have participated in this. Thank you so much for your attention, for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more of your questions. Feel free to come up to us afterwards. The one thing I guess I will leave you with is as I sort of indicated in my lead-in, I have really grown and changed and evolved, no pun intended, in my spiritual beliefs over time. And I fully intend and expect to continue to evolve in my spiritual beliefs over time. And I encourage all of you to remain open to yourself, to remain open to the sources of truth that are out there in the world, and to remain open to your peers who may share some of your beliefs, but who may differ in some fundamental ways. Remain in relationship, remain in conversation. It is how we grow and learn and can become better and move through the world in better ways. And so I really strongly encourage that. Thank you.
Malia, that was really wonderful and well said and well put. I appreciate those words. I like the house party comment. So I think maybe three things that I hope to leave you with, all right, from today's discussion. One is that hopefully you can walk away feeling that science does not constrain you to look only to science in your pursuit of truth and knowledge, right? So that fallacy, if you've come across that or struggled with that, I hope you're hearing from me and us, I believe, that you could set that aside, and that it doesn't imply that there are deeper spiritual realities necessarily, but it frees you to explore and ask questions and be in relationship, just as Malia said. So that's one. The second is continue to ask hard questions of yourself and of your peers and of those that are around you. And the hardest questions are those that are not sometimes even obvious to ask, like the ones that have come up today, such as, why do I even believe this? I didn't even think I had a worldview, but I seem to have strong opinions about what's good and what's bad. Where do I think that comes from? What does that mean about who I think I am? Right? Those are really, they may seem like, oh, I'll leave that for the philosophers, but I think every single one of us needs to engage those kinds of questions honestly and openly. And the more that you do that with one another, the better. Right? So I hope you leave today feeling encouraged to have those kinds of conversations. And particularly here, if we can't have them in academia, where are we going to have them? Right? So that's number two. The third that I would say is kind of comes back to this notion of responsibility. Right? I mentioned that for me, as I think about my calling as a Christian, and even what it means for me, right, for each of us to be made in the image of God, I feel a very strong calling that's placed on all Christians to be minister of reconciliation. Right? And I have to do the work to think about why is that my calling? How does that make sense with the story that God has unfolded over history ending with Christ? Right? Why does that make sense for me? Okay, but that's my work. I want you guys to do the work too. What do you think your responsibility is? Why? Right? Think about the framework that I've presented and that have been presented by Malia and Keolu. Right? Why does it make sense to you? Right? The different viewpoints that have been presented. Do some of that hard work. What resonates with you? Why does it resonate with you? Just because it feels good? Right? Work through those kinds of questions and don't just set them aside.
Great. Thank you.
Each one of these speakers here today gave up their evening just to be here, just talk to you right now. Can we have one more huge round of applause for every single one of them?
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.